Our sermon text today is found in Paul's letter to the Galatians. And I want to remind you that Paul was a theologian, a pragmatic pastor, and a community builder. Every community he entered was different, and the letters we find in the New Testament written by Paul are specific to a particular community, their problems, and their situation at the time. Today's letter is written to a group of great diversity, and in this letter, he pleads not for eradication of the differences, but eradication of dominance. Listen now to the word of the Lord, found in the 3rd chapter of Galatians, verses 23 through 29. Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore, the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian. For in Jesus Christ, you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Pray with me, please. Holy and living God, we give thanks to you for the gift of your Spirit as it moves in and among us on this day. As we hear your word and feel your Spirit, ignite our hearts so that your word comes to life and lives within us. May the words spoken today and the words that are heard be your words and not our own. You are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In the ancient world of Greece and Rome, it was a custom for wealthy families, when a child was born, a nurse or nursemaid would take responsibility of the newborn. After a certain period of time, the nurse would then pass that care on to a woman, an older woman, or a nanny who cared for the child until the child was about 6 years old. And then the child would become the responsibility of a pedagogist, a Greek word for guardian, custodian, and it oftentimes in those days was the job of an older male slave. The pedagogist would serve as a teacher and sometimes a supervisor. It was considered to be a very important role for a young person to have, and the pedagogist was often one of the more valuable people working in the household. This is a word that Paul uses about the law as he speaks to the Galatians in this passage. He tells them that it has been the law that has guided people of faith through all of the years, and it is the law that has guided the believers before the arrival of Christ. But the Galatians are to change their thinking from God of the law to God as a liberator of sin in and through Jesus Christ. The people of faith are to wear Christ, to be clothed in Christ. God's law is divinely appointed, and it is to lead people directly to Christ so that they may be justified in Christ. The work of Jesus Christ changed the relationship with the pedagogist or the law. To be clothed in Christ. What does that look like? Sister Joan Chittister is a renowned speaker and writer. As a spiritual advocate for peace, human rights, women's issues, and church renewals. She has written more than 50 books, and in a recent interview, she was asked how in the world did she know at the age of 3 that she wanted to be a Catholic nun and live in a convent, which she did and does. She tells a powerful story of being the only child of young parents when her father died. Her mother was dressing her to take her to the funeral parlor, and her mother's siblings said to her, "You cannot take a 3-year-old to a funeral parlor." Her 21-year-old mother said she absolutely would take her daughter to the funeral home, that her father had just died, and though she was only 3, she had to grieve and process this death just like everyone else. Sister Joan recalls with vivid description her mother standing beside the casket, holding her in her arms. Sister Joan says she was looking over her mother's shoulder and she felt the moisture from her mother's cheek. And she asked at the young age of 3, what or who are those 2 people who are standing at the end of that wooden box? And her mother explained to her, as we do to young children, that the 2 ladies were very special friends of her father's, that they had taught him in school. They were called sisters, and they would spend the night with her father. She explained to this small child that the sisters had a very special job to do. It was their job to be with her dad until God came to get her father. They would be there and tell God what a very special human being her father was. At that moment, the 3-year-old could think of no better way to do life than to do it waiting on God and giving over fathers of young children and telling them how special fathers are. Joan continues her story by saying that all through her childhood and through her teenage years until she entered the convent, every time she would walk down the street, she would run across the street sometimes when she saw a nun in a habit, and she would go up to them and thank them for being a sister in Christ and for the special job that they do. And she personally appreciated their work. As Presbyterians and other Protestants, we do not wear a habit or a white collar. So we have to be much more intentional about being clothed in Christ. We have to be intentional about loving our neighbors and loving our enemies and bringing in the outcast of society. We have to be more intentional in our efforts to eradicate dominance in the world. In the first century, there were things that led them to think differently about some stratas of people. There was a great separation of people. It was the men, usually the Jewish men, who were considered to be always better than, more significant than, and more valuable than other men. The beliefs were that all men, regardless of their status, were certainly more valuable and more significant than women. This thinking was held on to very proudly, especially by men. Even if they were less than, they still were more than women. Paul comes along and says to them, no, no, no. This is not what this is about. This is a different system. This is not a Roman system or a Greek system. This is Jesus' system. And there are no status distinctions. Sure, there's some obvious differences in the way people are dressed or the way people look. People have different color of eyes, there are different skin colors, there are different genders. But that is not what Jesus sees. Jesus sees all people the same. All are one in Christ. Paul tells the Galatians and speaks to us, if you believe in Jesus Christ, You're all the same. You're all one. We've certainly made some progress since the very first century in our thoughts of distinction and separation. But let's face it, friends, human nature leads us to gravitate to those that are like us. If a person walks into an auditorium or even a church building, typically they walk around in the back and stand on their tiptoes to see if they see any of their friends or people. And if they don't see someone that's like them, they will usually find a spot at the very back and sit alone. Paul is encouraging the Galatians to be confident as people of Christ. It doesn't matter where you sit or how you dress. You're all the same in Jesus Christ. Clothe yourself in Christ. Hold your heads high. You no longer have to hang your head as though a curse is hanging over you. You no longer have to live a life of passivity or live a life of defeat. All who believe are one. Some of you may have seen this past week the international news story of a situation out of Cambridge, England. It seems Dr. Paul Rimmer, who is a resident of Cambridge and also on faculty there, last week attended the evensong service at King's Chapel at Cambridge. He took his family there to worship. Dr. Rimmer's 9-year-old son, Tristan, is autistic. And I'm going to share with you a portion of Dr. Rimmer's letter, which has been made public with great apologies and much feedback that has followed. This is written, and you can tell it's written out of a place of deep pain, to the dean in charge of the college. I would like to apologize for bringing my autistic son to evensong at your chapel. I'm a resident of Cambridge and a member of the university, and my family and I have attended services at the chapel from time to time. I have always been inspired by the beauty of the building, the worshipful attitude of the service, and the hospitality you have extended to the wider community, as stated in your most recent welcome letter, which expressed, quote, your hope that whenever and however you share in the life of the chapel, you will be inspired, encouraged, and refreshed. You ask people to worship within a community that is asking a question: how can we enable disabled people to be at the heart of our communities, explore their vocation, and realize their gifts? End of quote. I chose to attend evensong on Trinity Sunday, also Father's Day, with my 2 sons, one of whom is autistic. Tristan is 9 years old and is a clever and joyful child who loves church buildings, services, and choral music. He's also nonverbal and expresses his excitement by calling out and laughing. His expressions can be loud and uncontainable. It is part of who he is. So there is no realistic way for him to be quiet. Many autistic people are like Tristan in this way. Right before the Kyrie, one of the ushers informed me that we were to lead the service. Tristan's expressions were apparently interfering with the enjoyment of some of the visitors, which was very inconsiderate on our part because tourists come from all over the world to hear evensong. The usher seemed embarrassed, but insisted as he asked us to leave. As a Christian, I believe that worship is primarily intended to glorify God and may have been misinterpreted. I may have misinterpreted your evensong as an actual worship service at which my son's expression must surely be pleasing to God, the experience of other worshipers being secondary. Our removal makes more sense if King's College Evensong were simply a concert. Then my son's expressions would frustrate the purpose of the performance, lessening the satisfaction of certain tourists around the world who attend, but not those kinds of people you deem to be too distracting. If this is so, I certainly apologize. Might I suggest that you place a sign in the front of the chapel clearly identifying which categories of people are welcome and which are not? I can only imagine how terrible it would be if autistic people and people with dementia or mental illnesses were all equally welcome to attend the services. How this would get in the way of the choir's performance, distract the choristers, and how upsetting it could be for all sorts of people who have traveled such a long way. My son may not be able to talk, but he knows perfectly well what is going on around him. This is not the first time my family has been asked to leave a church. He isn't even 10 years old, and he knows that he is unwelcome. If only places like King's College made it clear what kind of spectators are acceptable, my son would not be subjected to rejection and other people there to his unpalatable presence. As hard as we try, we fail to live out the unity in Christ that we know to be good and true. The broken church that we are, the broken human beings that we are, we fail. In the midst of our all too human feelings, we are scooped up, rescued, and saved by our forgiving and loving God. We all know the expression, blood is thicker than water, meaning our families are the ties that bind. Paul argues for the complete opposite of that expression and reminds us that through the waters of baptism, the closest bond is formed, a bond that is unimaginable. The waters of baptism are thicker than any blood, and we are joined to Christ in a spiritual bond stronger than any ties we have with family. The oneness of Christ replaces the pedagogus and is yet another great mystery reinforced and demonstrated as we are clothed in Christ. That, my friends, is the dress for success. To God be the glory, this day and forevermore. Amen.